My name is Mark Nanos. I teach at the University of Kansas, and I work on research on Paul from a Jewish perspective. And my collected essays are now available in Reading Paul Within Judaism, and subsequent volumes will be reading his other letters within Judaism. So Reading Paul Within Judaism is a way to try to frame the historiographical challenge to read Paul in a first century pre-Christianity way. It's regularly noted by scholars that there wasn't any Christianity yet. Paul doesn't even use the term Christian. And yet almost all readings are about Paul as the Christian missionary, Paul the convert. He writes to Christian Gentile churches. The picture on the cover of the book is a guy with a cross or a halo. So it's quite a challenge to think about reading him prior to Christianity. And Judaism is a helpful description for that. That if he is a Jewish guy, which everyone say he's still a Jew or Jewish, but they don't mean that he still practiced a Jewish way of life, which is what Judaism signifies, a Jewish way of life that the Jewish people created to guide them to live as Jewish people. And really the traditional readings and the New Perspective readings, and just about all readings of Paul, are from a later time, a different set of assumptions. Also, the title's functioning, Reading Paul Within Judaism, is functioning in conversation with what the other perspectives are called. The traditional perspective was not what it called itself. It was the only perspective, let's call it. But the new perspective on Paul in the last 40 years has created a new way of talking about Paul. But it's still a very Christian way of talking about Paul, because it's based on the same framework, the same sets of questions about salvation, the same presuppositions. It comes largely from the Augustinian, Luther, Calvin, Protestant sort of tradition. So what if you want to read Paul over as a historical figure who doesn't know all of that? Well, naturally, you might try to read him within Greco-Roman Judaism. You could make the title even longer and longer, a Greco-Roman Jewish way of life for Jews. But did he really still practice that way of life? And I think he did. And I think the people to whom he wrote these letters knew that he did and understood that he did. So when you change that set of presuppositions, guess what happens when you read the same phrases? You have different expectations of what the decoding process or interpretive process involves. So I'm trying to signal that. And in a way, it's a bit provocative. Who says that Paul was practicing and promoting Judaism? You just don't find language like that. And so it's defamiliarizing and hopefully challenging and makes you stop and wonder about the historical question. So when you start to approach Paul's texts, you don't do so innocently. Almost no one would, even if they've never taken a class about Paul, even if they're not churched. In Western culture, he's a figure you probably know something or think you know something, if it's nothing more than Caravaggio's painting that you assume is that Paul fell off a horse when he was converted, and that he's the quintessential convert from Judaism to founding Christianity and spreading Christianity. So what if you don't know that? What if the people to whom he wrote understood that they, even though they're non-Jews, and even though he has schooled them to remain non-Jews, that he's been enculturating them into a Jewish way of life and adapting it for non-Jews. And of course, other Jewish groups were doing that too. So the first presupposition, the first issue is knowing that you have presuppositions before you read about what you're going to read. And that's not just the primary sources, but the secondary sources as well. That's maybe the biggest one to start with. And the second one is then what you presuppose about the audience and how they'll decode this, what they know about Paul. So the usual assumption in all Paul scholarship, I would say, is that when Paul was with non-Jews in these Gentile churches, that he behaved in normative Gentile ways. For example, if food was served, it was BLTs, he was eating a BLT. Now, if he was with a Jewish group and he was trying to win them to Christ, evangelize them, then it might presume that he wouldn't eat the BLT, but that wouldn't be on offer anyway. So at most he has some Jewish habits, but he's really not practicing a Jewish way of life as a conviction, as a covenantal identity. So if you change that presupposition, what if he did? And not only that, what if he did? And not only what if he did, what if he presupposed that his audiences knew that? He had lived among them, seen how he lived. What if he wasn't asking the kinds of theological questions that Augustine was asking when he was fighting out his heresy wars in the 5th century and 4th century? What if he didn't know about the Protestant revolution at the end of the Middle Ages? What kind of questions would he ask as a Jewish person trying to figure out how to bring this Jewish message, this belief that the end of the ages had arrived, that at least in part, a time when the other nations would turn to the one God? If you ask, what would he tell them? And why would he need to write the kinds of things he does instructing them in how to live? What if there was no dichotomy of faith and works in the sort of traditional way? What if the issue wasn't racism, as the New Perspective sort of poses it, that Jewish people are exclusivistic and particularistic, but Christianity is universal, which is riddled with fallacies, because, of course, Christianity is every bit as particularistic. And Paul divided the world between those who followed Christ and those who didn't. That's every bit as particularistic. So there's nothing wrong with being particular per se, but it assumes there's something wrong. What if you don't know all those things? What would you look for in those texts? How would you decode them? So that's the kinds of things that I want to introduce a reader. It's not a how-to book, but it's my investigations of these texts, asking those questions and doing exegetical work, pointing in the kinds of directions that we could think about and see whether they make sense. The perspective that I have has a lot of implications for Christian-Jewish relations. I think it has some implications for Christian identity itself. It's taken me a long time to sort of get to those, but it would be hard to deny that in Western culture has been shaped by voices like Paul's and other New Testament voices, understood as Christian voices, speaking about the Jewish other, the Jewish person, Jewish way of life, Judaism, Torah, law, as it's usually framed. And that's been made the contrasting other, at best an inferior other that Paul converted away from and is bringing people to something else, but often a negative other. And that shapes Christian imagination. It's there not just in the way you think, but the way Christians write and talk, and the way they've behaved towards Jews often enough. It's a tragic history. So if you rethink Paul as a Jewish figure, practicing a Jewish way of life, who observes Torah as a good thing, and he's bringing non-Jews into a Jewish way of life, even though they don't become Jews, even though they're not technically under Torah, he's teaching them how to behave Torah-ishly, if you will, righteously. Because that's what Torah is. It's a guide for how to live righteous for the Jewish people. If he's coming into Jewish groups, which I propose, rather than into separated Gentile churches, that would alter the othering that's been instinctive in Christian identity. For Jewish-Christian relations or Christian-Jewish relations, it would be profound, and almost all readers and reviewers who maybe don't even like what I'm doing recognize that. And often it's even a starting place for criticism, as if that's the motivation. It is certainly part of the interest that I have in why I do it, but I do it on the basis of a historical insight that I think that this could be helpful. I think it also could affect Christian identity. Does Christian identity really need a negative other? And if it needs a negative Jewish other to get to what it is, maybe that contributes to the gendered other, to the colored other, differently colored other, I should say. Maybe the poor or the uneducated or the intellectuals or all the other othering that tends to be Well, it seems common enough to me when I read the Christian discussions of Jews and Judaism, and Christians' discussions of self. What if you think in more Jewish ways that you don't have this binary of faith versus works? What would that do to Christian imagination and spirituality? So the implications are many.